95 tons of American iron, 5 cubic yards per bite, 8 tons of rock and jungle with every swing of the boom. They called them steam shovels. The French called them impossible. The French were wrong. Between 1904 and 1914, 102 of these coal-burning monsters tore through the spine of Central America and connected 2 oceans. They consumed 4 tons of coal an hour. They worked in heat that killed men where they stood. And when the mountains fought back, when 500,000 cubic yards of mud came sliding down without warning, the operators didn't run. They climbed back into those open cabs and kept digging. 22,000 men had already died trying to build this canal. Disease had beaten the French. The jungle had buried their equipment. Yellow fever turned their hospitals into death traps. By 1889, they'd given up. But in 1904, America brought the Bucyrus. This is the story of the machines that shouldn't have worked, but did. The question we're asking, what did it cost? The graveyard. America inherited the Isthmus of Panama, 1904. 50 miles of volcanic rock, soft clay, and jungle so thick you couldn't see 10 feet ahead. Rain 9 months a year. Mosquitoes by the millions, and buried in the mud, the corpses of a French dream. Ferdinand de Lesseps had built the Suez Canal. Suez made him a god. So when he announced in 1880 that he'd dig a sea-level canal through Panama, 800,000 French citizens bet their life savings. De Lesseps promised them glory. He promised them wealth. He promised them a canal in 6 years. He delivered them mass graves. The French arrived in 1881 with steam-powered excavators, primitive chain-driven machines that had worked in Egypt. But Panama wasn't Egypt. Panama was vertical jungle with volcanic rock, unstable clay, and torrential rain 9 months a year. The French excavators broke down constantly. When they worked, they moved dirt like old men with shovels. In 8 years, working crews of thousands, the French managed to excavate 78 million cubic yards, respectable for a railroad cut, nowhere near enough for a canal. And then the dying started in earnest. Yellow fever didn't just kill. It was theatrical in its cruelty. Men turned yellow as their livers failed. High fevers cooked their brains. And in the final stage, the stage the locals called vomito negro, they hemorrhaged internally and vomited coagulated blood until they died. The French didn't understand disease. No one did yet. The scientific consensus said yellow fever came from filth, from rotting garbage, from bad air rising out of tropical soil. So the French built beautiful hospitals, clean, airy, flowers in clay pots to cheer up the patients, and they set those pots in bowls of water to keep the ants away. Perfect mosquito breeding grounds. The hospitals became death factories. 3/4 of French engineers died within 3 months. During wet seasons, 30 to 40 workers died daily. The death trains ran continuously. Railroad cars stacked with bodies, hauling them to mass graves in the jungle. The living French workers watched those trains and calculated their own odds. Most didn't like the math. They left. The ones who stayed died at such rates that recruitment dried up. No amount of money could convince workers to come to what newspapers were calling the white man's graveyard. By 1889, de Lesseps was bankrupt. 22,000 men were dead, maybe more, because no one had kept careful records of the Caribbean workers who died by the thousands. 800,000 investors had lost everything. The company collapsed. The equipment was abandoned where it stood. And in the jungle, rusting French excavators sat half buried in mud, monuments to the limits of European determination. But the problem wasn't just disease, it was the mountain. The Continental Divide rose 194 feet above sea level at a place called Culebra, a volcanic spine of rock 8 miles long, blocking the path between oceans. The French had tried to cut through it. They'd barely made a dent. The rock was unstable, soft clay sitting on top of hard volcanic stone. When you dug into the clay, it slid and kept sliding. The French engineers had called it impossible. They'd written reports saying the angles wouldn't hold, the clay wouldn't stabilize, the mountain wouldn't yield, and they'd been right, at least with the tools they had. 15 years later, America looked at that graveyard and made a different calculation. We'll do it differently. We'll bring machines the world has never seen. 95 tons of American certainty. November 1904, the first Bucyrus steam shovels rolled off the ships at Colon, manufactured in South Milwaukee, Wisconsin, by the Bucyrus Foundry and Manufacturing Company. 95 tons per machine, 5 cubic yard buckets with steel teeth, coal-fired boilers capable of producing enough steam pressure to rip through solid rock, built like locomotives with an attitude problem. The Bucyrus Company had been making steam shovels since 1896. They dug railroad cuts across America and excavated foundations for the first skyscrapers. But Panama was different. Panama was going to prove whether American engineering could beat geography itself. Bucyrus supplied 77 of the 102 steam shovels ordered. Marion Steam Shovel Company from Ohio supplied most of the rest. These weren't upgraded French excavators. These were entirely different beasts. The French machines had been slow, fragile, mounted on static platforms. The American shovels were mounted on railroad tracks and could move themselves. The French used chains that broke constantly. The Americans used steel cables and double-drum hoist systems designed for immense loads. The Bucyrus 95-ton model was marketed as the most powerful steam shovel ever built, and the numbers backed it up. A single shovel could move 8 tons of material with one scoop. 8 tons, 16,000 pounds of rock, clay, and jungle, lifted and dumped in less than a minute. In March 1910, a single Bucyrus steam shovel excavated 70,000 cubic yards of material in 26 days at the Culebra Cut. That's not a work rate. That's a war rate. It's the machine equivalent of scorched earth. Over the 10 years of American construction, each shovel averaged over 1 million cubic yards excavated. One machine, 1 million cubic yards. Multiply that by 77 Bucyrus shovels alone, and you start to understand the scale. Compare that to what the French had managed. Working for 8 years with primitive excavators and hand labor, they'd moved 78 million cubic yards total. The American machines, working for 10 years, moved 232 million cubic yards, 3 times as much, in only 2 more years. The American shovels could dig 3 to 5 times more dirt, 3 to 5 times faster than the French excavators. What had taken the French a month now took a Bucyrus a week. What had seemed impossible now seemed inevitable. But speed was only part of the engineering miracle. These machines ran on steam. Here's how they worked. At the rear of the machine, a vertical boiler, coal-fired, producing steam at pressures high enough to be lethal if the boiler ruptured. At the front, a boom, a long articulated arm extending out from the machine body with a dipper bucket at the end. The bucket was 5 cubic yards capacity, equipped with steel teeth designed to bite through rock. The boom could swing in a limited arc, about 180 degrees on most models, and could be raised or lowered using the cable system. Connecting it all, chains, steel cables, and a double drum hoist system powered entirely by steam pressure. Here's the chain reaction. Coal goes into the firebox. 2 firemen, not metaphorical firemen, but actual crew members whose only job was feeding the fire, shoveled coal constantly to keep the boiler pressure steady. The fire heats water in the boiler. Water becomes steam. Steam is channeled into pistons. The pistons drive gears. The gears pull chains and cables. The cables lift the dipper arm, swing the boom, and operate the bucket. Everything, every movement, every ton of force came from burning coal and boiling water. The engineer sat at the controls, levers and valves that controlled every motion of the beast. One lever to crowd the dipper forward into the rock face, one to lift the loaded bucket, one to swing the boom toward the waiting railroad car, one to trip the bucket mechanism and dump the load. Skilled operators could fill a railroad car in 3 minutes, but here's what made them dangerous. The operator sat in an open cab. No roof, no protective cage, no safety glass, just a seat, some levers, and a prayer. When the dipper bit into the rock face, tons of material came loose. Boulders rolled, rock fragments flew. Dust clouds rose so thick you couldn't see the dipper bucket. And if a landslide started while you were digging, if the entire rock face decided to let go while you were mid-swing, you were sitting directly in the slide path. The shovel rested on railroad tracks. A ground crew of 6 men laid new track sections as the shovel advanced. Every few hours, the entire machine had to crawl forward on those tracks, slowly, ponderously, like a 95-ton insect with a coal-burning heart, to keep working the face. The crawler mechanism used the same steam-driven chains. It could move 50 feet an hour when conditions were good, and if a track section gave way, the machine tipped over. It happened. Steam shovel accidents weren't rare, they were expected. An overturned shovel meant days of work to right it, repair it, get it operational again. If the boiler ruptured during the fall, if steam pressure was vented suddenly into the surrounding air, men died, and the face they were working? That's where the impossibility truly lived, the Culebra Cut, 8 miles long. The plan: carve a channel at least 300 feet wide, cutting the summit elevation from 194 feet down to 39 feet above sea level, through volcanic rock that crumbled, through soft clay that slid, in a jungle that received torrential rain 9 months a year, and turned the work sites into swamps. 6,000 men worked the cut daily at peak construction. 300 pneumatic drills punched holes for dynamite charges. 60 to 70 steam shovels loaded railroad cars simultaneously. Up to 160 trains per day hauled spoil away to dump sites in the coastal swamps. The noise was unrelenting. For 7 years, the Culebra Cut never went silent. Not for an hour, not for a shift. The sound of drills hammering rock, dynamite blasting, steam shovels loading cars, locomotives pulling loads, and thousands of men shouting to be heard echoed off the canyon walls and created a continuous roar that workers compared to standing next to 100 pieces of modern heavy equipment running simultaneously. There was no hearing protection. The operators just went deaf. And the heat. On the floor of the cut, temperatures regularly hit 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The tropical sun beat down. The canyon walls reflected heat back, and the steam shovels, with their coal-fired boilers running continuously, radiated even more heat. The men stoking those boilers worked shirtless, drenched in sweat, shoveling coal into a firebox in 100-degree weather with heat radiating at them from inches away. Some of them lasted a month before their bodies gave out. Some lasted a week. The turnover rate for firemen was brutal, but the real enemy wasn't the heat, wasn't the noise, wasn't even the machines. It was the mountain fighting back. The men who fed the fire. A steam shovel crew was 4 men, and every single one of them knew they were riding a beast that could kill them in a dozen different ways. The engineer sat at the controls. He was the highest-paid man on the crew, $210 to $240 a month, plus free housing and medical care provided by the government. That was excellent money in 1910. Skilled tradesmen in the States made half that. But it was also hazard pay, and everyone knew it. His job? Operate the boom, control the dipper, time the swings, load the railroad cars without crushing anyone, and watch the rock face continuously for signs it was about to collapse, all while sitting in an open cab with boulders rolling past his head and dynamite charges going off 50 yards away. The engineer needed to know his machine intimately, how much weight the cables could handle, when the rock would give way, when a chain was breaking. Get it wrong, and people died. Behind him, the firemen, 2 of them per shovel, working in shifts because no man could sustain the work rate for a full day. Their job was simple and brutal: keep the coal burning. 4 tons of coal went into some of the larger operations every hour. The firemen shoveled it in by hand. No mechanical feeders on the Panama shovels, no automation. Just 2 men with shovels, working as fast as they could to keep the boiler pressure steady. When pressure dropped, the machine slowed. When it slowed, you found replacements or the shovel stopped moving. They worked in heat from the firebox, exceeding 150 degrees, in the Panamanian sun, with no shade. One fireman described it as standing inside an oven with a torch held to your face. The turnover rate was brutal. Mostly West Indian laborers from Jamaica and Barbados, men who'd grown up in tropical heat, could sustain the work. And then there was the crane man. He operated the hoist drums that raised and lowered the dipper, coordinating with the engineer. Timing was everything. Drop the bucket too fast, and the chains snapped. Too slow, and you lost rhythm. Miss the timing, and you buried a railroad worker under 8 tons of rock. The craneman watched 3 things simultaneously: the dipper bucket, the railroad car being loaded, and the cable tension gauge. If the tension spiked, a cable was about to snap. If it dropped suddenly, something had broken. He had maybe 2 seconds to react before catastrophe. But the real danger, the thing that killed more crew members than anything else, was maintenance. Steam shovels broke constantly. The bearings wore out under the immense loads, chains stretched and snapped, cables frayed from continuous friction, gears stripped, boiler tubes cracked, and when something broke, you couldn't just shut down and wait for parts to arrive from Wisconsin. The engineers demanded continuous operation. The canal was behind schedule. Every day of delay cost money and political capital. So the crews fixed things while the machine was running. Men climbed onto the boom to grease bearings while the shovel was swinging loads. They crawled under the chassis to adjust tracks while the machine was moving forward. If a chain broke mid-swing, someone had to shimmy out onto the boom arm, suspended over a 40-foot pit with the loaded dipper swaying below them, and rethread the connection by hand. One missed step, and you fell 40 feet onto rocks. One wrong move, and the boom swung into you with 95 tons of force. One moment of inattention, and the next load buried you. The workers had a name for the Culebra Cut. They called it Hell's Gorge. Not because of the heat, though the heat was hellish. Not because of the noise, though the noise was maddening. They called it Hell's Gorge because men died there every single day, and there was nothing you could do but keep working. Every shift, someone fell. Every week, someone was crushed. Every month, someone was buried in a landslide or blown apart by dynamite or electrocuted by the overhead power lines that fed the lights. Twice daily, work stopped for dynamite blasting. The steam shovels pulled back from the face. The workers cleared the danger zone, a radius of several hundred feet. The blast crews set off the charges. 600 holes drilled into the rock, each packed with dynamite, all fired simultaneously in a coordinated sequence. The mountain shook. The ground jumped. Rock and debris rained down like hail. Then the dust cleared. The shovels moved back in, and the crews started loading the loose spoil onto railroad cars. Except sometimes the dynamite didn't all go off. Unexploded charges sat buried in the rubble. The steam shovel operators didn't know they were there. The drill crews didn't know they were there. The blast crews didn't know they were there, until the dipper bit into one. Then the world turned into fire, and flying metal and screaming. One worker, a Spanish laborer, was killed instantly when his shovel hit an unexploded charge during a normal loading operation. The blast destroyed the machine and killed 2 other crew members. Later, investigators discovered the dead Spanish worker had been a celebrated lawyer back in Spain, well-educated, wealthy family, respected in his community. No one ever found out why he'd been digging ditches in Panama. The blast didn't care about his credentials, neither did the jungle. He was buried in an unmarked grave with the other workers. And then there were the landslides. For months, the shovels kept digging. The operators watched the rock face. They saw the cracks forming in the clay layers. They saw the seepage where water was undermining the stability. They saw the clay creeping, moving inches per day, slowly sliding downhill under its own weight. They reported it to the engineers. The engineers noted it in their logs, and everyone kept working, because what else could they do? And then one day, the mountain decided it had had enough. When the mountain struck back, October 4th, 1907, Cucaracha section of the Culebra Cut, a crack appeared in the rock face that morning. By noon, it had widened to 6 inches. Workers stopped loading. The shovels pulled away. Engineer David Gaillard came to inspect. He stood at the bottom and looked up. 500,000 cubic yards of soft clay sat above the crack, saturated from recent rains. The crack was widening. By evening, 500,000 cubic yards of soft clay let go and slid into the cut. The slide moved like a glacier, slow, inexorable, a river of mud instead of ice. Railroad tracks buckled. Equipment was swallowed. The excavation filled with mud 30 feet deep. The clay was too soft for the steam shovels to dig. The dippers just sank into it like quicksand. You couldn't load it onto railroad cars because it wouldn't hold its shape. You couldn't blast it with dynamite because it absorbed the force. So the engineers tried something desperate. They brought pumps and fire hoses from the top and sluiced the mud with water. High-pressure streams washing the clay away, like panning for gold. It worked, barely. But the slide had scared everyone. French engineers had predicted this exact failure. They'd written reports in the 1880s saying the rock wouldn't hold at the angles the Americans were cutting. They'd said the soft clay layers over hard volcanic rock would slide at the first opportunity. They'd been ignored by de Lesseps, and the French project had failed. Now the Americans were seeing the same thing, and many people, engineers, investors, even some American workers, started saying construction was impossible. The mountain had proven the French engineers right. Chief Engineer Gaillard ignored them. He was a West Point-trained civil engineer with canal experience, brought in specifically to handle the Culebra Cut, and he made a call that probably saved the project. Who ordered the crews to remove material from the upper levels of the cut, the slopes above the floor, reducing the weight pressing down on the unstable clay layers below. It meant excavating millions of cubic yards more than originally planned. It meant widening the cut far beyond the minimum 300 feet. It meant more cost, more time, more work, but it stabilized the slopes, mostly. The shovels kept digging, and the mountain kept sliding. Over the next 7 years, the Culebra Cut experienced over 100 major landslides. Some crept slowly, inches per day, giving the workers time to move equipment and get clear. Some came without warning and buried everything in their path. May 29, 1913. Steam shovel number 258 was working when the operator felt the ground shift. He had maybe 3 seconds. He could jump clear or try to stabilize the shovel. He chose wrong. The ground gave way. The entire shovel, 95 tons, slid sideways into debris. The railroad cars went with it. The crew survived. All 4 men climbed out bruised but alive. The shovel was buried under 15 feet of debris. It took 3 weeks to dig it out. The boom was bent, cables snapped, boiler cracked. Shovel 258 never dug again. But landslides weren't the only thing killing workers. December 12, 1908, Bas Obispo, on the west bank of the Culebra Cut. A storage area near the blast sites held 22 to 25 tons of dynamite. The sources disagree on the exact amount. Wooden crates stacked in rows, waiting to be distributed to the drill crews. Guarded supposedly, but guards couldn't stop what happened next. At 11:45 a.m. it detonated. Premature explosion, no warning, no fire, no impact. The dynamite in the tropical heat had become unstable and simply went off. 23 to 26 men killed instantly. The exact count is disputed because the blast destroyed bodies so thoroughly that identification was impossible. 40 to 49 injured, many of them so badly burned or mangled that they died later in the hospitals. The explosion was heard 3 miles away. Workers at distant sections of the canal heard the blast and knew immediately what had happened. Smoke rose visible from everywhere in the Canal Zone, a black column against the jungle, marking the spot where men had just died. The shock wave knocked glasses and dishes off shelves in workers' homes miles from the site. Windows shattered, walls cracked. People as far away as Colon felt the ground shake. One witness, Amos E. Clark, later wrote, "It was something terrible and awful to look at." The explosion was heard 3 miles away. The shock knocked off glasses from tables and shelves in many homes. Another worker, the father of one of the school teacher's pupils, saw the blast coming, saw the initial smoke, and realized what was about to happen. He was standing next to a steam shovel. In the second before the shock wave hit, he dove into the dipper bucket and crouched there while chunks of rock and debris rained down. When the dust settled, the shovel was completely covered in debris. Boulders the size of cars had fallen around it, but the steel bucket had protected him. He crawled out alive, covered in dust and blood from shrapnel cuts, but alive. The other 23 weren't so lucky. That wasn't the only premature blast. 60 million pounds of dynamite were used over 10 years, and the workers handled it with shocking casualness. They carried 50-pound boxes on their heads, long lines marching to blast sites, each man balancing high explosives on uneven ground in the heat. Sometimes a man stumbled. Sometimes the dynamite just went off. West Indian workers, black laborers from Jamaica and Barbados, did most of the dynamite handling. They were called powder men. Many left their belongings with friends before each shift. Some never came back. After the Bas Obispo disaster, Chief Engineer Goethals publicly stated, "We are having too many accidents with blasts." Procedures tightened. Dynamite handling became more scientific. Concrete magazines were built farther from congested work areas. Temperature monitoring was implemented, but there were no sensors, no automatic cutoffs, no safety interlocks, no remote detonators that could be triggered from a safe distance. The only safety system was human instinct and careful procedure. And instinct doesn't stop a landslide. Procedure doesn't predict when unstable dynamite will cook off in the sun. From 1904 to 1914, the official death count was 5,609 workers. But that's the official count, the bodies they found and recorded. Many historians believe the real number was several times higher. Bodies buried in landslides were never recovered. Workers who died in their barracks from injuries or exhaustion weren't always counted in the official statistics, and the records distinguished between white workers and black workers in ways that make the accounting suspect. Here's what we know for sure from the official records. 350 white workers died. 4,500 black workers, mostly from Jamaica and Barbados, died. In 1906, at the height of construction, black workers were dying at 10 times the rate of white workers. 10 times. Why? Because black workers got the worst jobs. They drilled the blast holes that often hid unexploded charges. They carried the dynamite that sometimes detonated in their hands. They laid the railroad tracks in front of advancing steam shovels and landslides. They lived in unscreened barracks outside the mosquito-controlled zones that white workers occupied. And when the landslides came, they were the ones standing at the bottom of the cut, loading railroad cars closest to the slide path. A laborer named Alfred Doughton, who survived the construction and lived into old age, later recalled, "The working conditions in those days were so horrible it would stagger your imagination. Death was our constant companion. I shall never forget the trainloads of dead men being carted away daily, as if they were just so much lumber." The funeral trains were regular equipment on the Panama Railroad. Every day cars marked "funeral car" ran between the work sites and the cemeteries. Behind them, coaches carried wounded men to the hospital, men who'd been crushed under rock, burned by steam, blown apart by dynamite, or buried in landslides. One teacher stationed in the Canal Zone described seeing those trains pass regularly. After a while, the sight became routine. Just another train. just another load, just another day. That's what happens when people die every day for 10 years. It stops being tragic. It becomes infrastructure. By 1909, accidents had replaced disease as the leading cause of death in the Canal Zone. The mosquitoes were under control. William Crawford Gorgas, the chief sanitary officer, had essentially eradicated yellow fever through aggressive mosquito control measures. Malaria cases had dropped by 90%. The diseases that had killed 22,000 French workers were beaten. But the machines, the explosives, the landslides, the sheer physical danger of the work, those kept killing, and the steam shovels kept digging. Because stopping wasn't an option. The world was watching. American credibility was on the line, and the workers, the men who climbed into those cabs every morning, knowing they might not climb out, they kept working, because that's what the job demanded. Steel rusts, but some things don't fade. August 15, 1914. The SS Ancon, a cargo and passenger ship that had spent years hauling cement and supplies to the canal, became the first vessel to officially transit the Panama Canal. The trip took approximately 9 hours from the Atlantic to the Pacific, 8,000 miles of ocean voyage eliminated. The deadly passage around Cape Horn avoided. Ships that once took 67 days to sail from New York to San Francisco could now make the trip in less than 3 weeks. The canal opened 2 years ahead of schedule. The target completion date had been June 10, 1916. The canal opened August 15, 1914. The American phase had excavated 232 million cubic yards of earth and rock. Combined with the 78 million cubic yards the French had excavated, the total was over 310 million cubic yards. If you loaded all that material onto railroad flat cars and lined them up end to end, the train would circle the Earth 4 times. The cost? Nearly $500 million in 1914 dollars, roughly equivalent to $16.1 billion today. The largest American engineering project to that date, larger than anything attempted since the Egyptian pyramids. And the human cost? 27,609 lives lost, 22,000 French, 5,609 American, though nobody believes that American number. The real toll was higher. How much higher, we'll never know. Some men just disappeared into the jungle. Some were buried in slides that were never fully excavated. Some died of injuries or disease in their barracks and weren't counted in the official statistics. But the canal worked. 77 Bucyrus steam shovels had torn through the Culebra Cut. They'd moved mountains, literally. They'd worked in conditions that would shut down any modern construction project instantly. And they'd proven that American industrial engineering could accomplish what European hand labor could not. The question nobody wanted to ask, was it worth it? The dead couldn't answer. The survivors mostly said yes. The canal transformed global shipping, enabled American naval dominance of 2 oceans, and accelerated economic growth worldwide. But ask the families of the 4,500 black workers who died, most of them making a fraction of what white workers earned for doing the same jobs in worse conditions, and you might get a different answer. So what happened to the machines? Most of the steam shovels were scrapped in Panama once the work was done. A few were sold to copper mines in Chile in 1914, where they dug ore for another decade before wearing out. Only one of the later Model 50B shovels, a variant sent to Panama for infrastructure work after the main canal was complete, survived the scrapyards. That shovel was shipped back to California, then transported to Colorado, where it worked a gold placer mine near Nederland until 1978. Today, it sits at the Nederland Mining Museum, one of only 2 operational Bucyrus 50B steam shovels left in the world. The rest? Gone, melted down, sold for parts, abandoned in fields where rust and time have reduced them to skeletons. 2 shovels still sit rusting beside Interstate 5 in Zamora, California. If you're driving north from Sacramento and you know where to look, you can see them from the highway, hulking metal corpses slowly being reclaimed by weeds. Monuments to an era when men built with steam and steel and didn't worry much about coming home at the end of the day. By the 1930s, diesel-powered shovels had replaced the steam models. Cheaper, simpler. One operator instead of four. No coal, no boilers. The steam shovel era ended quietly. After World War II, hydraulic excavators replaced even the diesel shovels. The cable and chain systems were done. But here's what didn't fade. Every bridge built in the early 20th century, dug by steam shovels. Every skyscraper foundation in New York, Chicago, San Francisco, excavated by steam power. The Holland Tunnel connecting New York and New Jersey. The subway systems under major American cities. The railroad cuts that opened the American West to settlement and industry. And the Panama Canal itself, still operating, still connecting two oceans, 110 years after it opened. The canal sees 14,000 ships a year now. In 1914, it was 1,000. The expanded locks completed in 2016 can handle container vessels longer than 3 football fields, carrying cargo worth billions. The Bucyrus operators wouldn't recognize them, but they'd understand the principle. The Culebra Cut is still there. The rock faces are still there, scarred from a century of weathering and the occasional landslide, because yes, the mountain still slides sometimes. In September 1915, barely a year after opening, a massive slide closed the canal for 7 months while crews dug it out. And if you stand at the bottom of the cut today and look up at the walls that were carved by men sitting in open-cab steam shovels while landslides rained down around them, you can still see the bite marks. The scars where dippers tore into rock, the benches where the excavation stepped down level by level. 75 acres of the town of Culebra slid into the cut during construction. The buildings were marked, dismantled, and moved as the ground crept forward. Some of those buildings were moved 3 times before they found stable ground. The mountain never stopped fighting, but the shovels had already won. Monuments in rust. David Dubose Gaillard, the engineer who oversaw the Culebra Cut excavation, was promoted to colonel in 1913. 1 month later, he died of a brain tumor in Baltimore. He never saw the canal open. The cut was renamed Gaillard Cut in his honor in 1915. In 2000, when Panama took full control, they changed the name back to Culebra. The steam shovel operators? Most of their names are lost. They were skilled workers, well paid, but not famous. They showed up, ran the machines, and went home. Or didn't. The records list causes of death: mining accidents, landslides, railroad mishaps, fractures, amputations, crushing injuries, burns. They don't always list names. They especially don't list names if the workers were black or West Indian, or categorized under the silver roll payroll that marked them as second class. Between 1910 and 1912, Ancon Hospital treated 22,000 surgical cases. Half were traumatic injuries from construction. Mining accidents led the list at over 4,600. Then fractures, cutting instruments, railroad accidents, amputations. The men operating those steam shovels weren't stupid. They weren't careless. They weren't reckless daredevils with a death wish. They were skilled professionals working with equipment that had no margin for error, in an environment that was actively trying to kill them for a project that people had said was impossible. And they did it anyway, because that's what the job was. That's what America needed. That's what connecting two oceans required. There's a bronze plaque at the Panama Canal Administration Building in Balboa. It commemorates Colonel Gaillard and the workers who died building the canal. The plaque shows 2 laborers digging in the cut with steam shovels in the background. That's the image that survives. Men and machines working together, moving earth that couldn't be moved. The canal that connected 2 oceans wasn't dug by nations or governments or grand visions of progress. It was dug by men who climbed into open cabs every morning at dawn, fired up coal-burning boilers that could explode if the pressure spiked and bit into a mountain until the mountain gave up. 27,609 of them didn't live to see it finished, but the ones who did, they'd carved through the Continental Divide. They'd moved 310 million cubic yards of earth with machines powered by coal and steam and human determination. They'd built something the French said was impossible. They'd connected two oceans. The machines are gone now, rusted, scrapped, melted down, and reforged into other tools for other jobs. But every ship that passes through the Panama Canal, every container vessel carrying goods between Asia and America, every cruise ship avoiding the Drake Passage, every naval destroyer transiting between fleets, sails over the graves of the men who ran those machines. The channel they carved is still there. The locks they built still lift ships over mountains. The vision they executed still shapes global trade. They don't make them like that anymore, not the machines and not the men.